Hello fellow artists, join me today while I demonstrate my layering techniques for these watercolor poppies on handmade watercolor paper. All right, so here we go. This is handmade watercolor paper, so it's really thick. It held a ton of water, which is why I sprayed right there. Now that it's super wet, I am using a mixture of a forest green and a Payne's gray, little yellow it looks like, to create some grass. And you notice how I'm holding my brush sideways, not vertical up and down. Adding some darker color in there for some darker values, and the paper is just really absorbing this watercolor. So you see I made a little darker, added a little darker like a forest green there. While it's still wet, the fun part is coming here, adding the poppies. I'm just dropping in the red there, which is a mixture of Winsor red and alizarin crimson. All I'm doing is using the tip of my brush with, you can kind of see the consistency of my paint is a little thicker because the paper is so wet. So I've got a creamy consistency going on, which is really, really important when you're using watercolors, is to understand the different consistencies of your puddles. So I'm gonna drop in some more red here for another poppy, and this time this one's gonna be a little darker because now I'm starting to do the poppies that are closer to the foreground. So those poppies are gonna be a little darker, a little bigger, and definitely a little more detail. Now these poppies, they are blending out. They are still in the background, but I am making them a little bigger because they're not that far back. I still want them kind of close up. That's why they're a little bit on the bigger side. Anyway, I've cut out a lot of the parts where I'm mixing off camera, so you don't have to stare at, the scene for a few minutes, but it does take time. If you're new to watercolors, I'm not just grabbing any color. I'm spending a minute or two mixing and getting the consistency that I want, meaning whether I want it super watery, a cream mixture, milky mixture. So that takes time, and that definitely takes practice. So what I'm doing here is adding a little yellow to the red, so it kind of blends in and has like a hazy effect. Now I'm adding a little contrast, and you can see that's a little dark. So I added some green to my creamy consistency on the right, which leads me to my most important tip in watercolors, is making sure your paint consistency is thicker than the dampness of your paper. So my paper is very, very damp right now. If you like this video, please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps me make more videos for you. Thank you. It has dried a little bit. It's been maybe 15 minutes since I got it super wet. So it is drying a little bit. So that's why the paint is not spreading out as much as it was for the grass. Okay, it's drying. So my paint has to be thicker than the dampness of the paper. So my brush is not loaded with a lot of water. You can see it's not creating any kind of bleed, or there's no dripping of water on my brush, right? And the paint is pretty much staying where I want it to stay, but the paper is still really damp. So I have to have enough paint on my brush for it to adhere to the paper. And that just takes a lot of practice. And I don't suggest starting with handmade watercolor paper because it is very thick and very tricky to work with. I suggest starting out, if you're new, with 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper, preferably Arches. And there's a link to that paper in the description. And while the paper is still wet, I am doing some little buds, just some yellow, red, and green little dots. Then it's time to dry it because I'm ready for some detail. Now that everything's dry, I'm wetting it again. Of course. You can kind of see my my sketch there of the poppy, just the shape. This is going to be kind of more in detail. It's going to be more in the foreground. So you can see how long it's taking me to wet the poppy, because again, this paper is super, super thick. And now the fun part, adding the red to the water in there so it will only go where I put the water. And you can kind of see, I'll zoom in here. I'm dropping in the red color, which is kind of known as charging as well, and making some darker areas and leaving some lighter areas, my different values basically. And I actually, I'm editing out these little pauses, areas where I'm mixing up my puddles. So I'm not, once again, I'm not just, dropping in a color right off of my palette. I'm taking some time here and mixing it and getting the right consistency that I'm looking for. I'm speeding this up a little bit here. I'm pretty much doing the same thing for the other poppies, wetting the area and then adding yellow, adding some red, placing the water down first, which is what I'm doing right here, then adding the color. That way I get the nice bleed that I'm after. Now, while the red poppies are still wet, adding a little contrast, some darker color. This is probably burnt sienna. I'm not really sure. I don't remember, but any darker color so you have a shadow underneath is fine. And then while it's wet, it just bleeds right into the red, and you can see the ones underneath have dried, and it just looks really fun and pretty. And onto the stems. So this area of the paper is dry. If you remember, I dried it earlier. I have a small size 1 brush, I'm guessing, and I have some pretty thick paint for my stems. Just a nice green paint, green yellow-ish color will do just fine. And after doing a couple stems, I'm making some little buds, doing some bluish brown colors. Looks pretty. Time for a little splash effect. Getting some thicker color, some really strong pigment on the buds. And now that my poppies are dry, I am doing the final layers for more detail. I'm going to be speeding this up here a little bit. Adding some splash for some final details. I tested on a scratch piece of paper. This is a pretty turquoise color, and I like to blot it a little bit with a tissue or just my wet brush, so you have different values of the splashes. And here we go, the finished painting. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please hit like and subscribe. And click the link below if you'd like to be part of my beginner's watercolor membership. Hope to see you there. Thank you.